On a typical Monday morning, Michael sat at his desk, surrounded by the quiet hum of his office. The screens flickered to life as he booted up his computer, his fingers dancing over the keyboard, entering the usual work requests and messages from clients. He had been at the company for nearly 5 years, quietly doing his job and trying to keep a low profile. To some, his approach to work might have seemed dull or even unremarkable, but Michael knew he was good at what he did. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, nor the most outspoken, but he always got the job done. His colleagues often referred to him as the silent backbone of the office, the one who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to keep things running smoothly. Today felt like any other day. The usual grind of emails and meetings loomed ahead, nothing particularly special. But something about the air in the office felt heavier. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that change was in the air, but he had no idea what that change would bring. At 9 a.m., the team gathered in the conference room for the weekly meeting. Michael, as always, took a seat near the back. His boss, Janet, a woman in her mid-40s with a sharp demeanor and an even sharper tongue, was at the head of the table. Janet had always been a force to be reckoned with, quick to praise those who pleased her and just as quick to tear down anyone she considered beneath her. She was known for her high expectations and her even higher standards, and she made it clear that she demanded perfection from everyone around her. Michael had always been cautious with her, keeping his head down and doing his work to the best of his ability, hoping to avoid her wrath. But despite his efforts, Janet had always made it clear that she saw him as expendable. The meeting began, and Janet went through the usual updates, discussing projects and deadlines. Michael half listened, his mind drifting in and out of focus as he mentally prepared for the day ahead. He had a project to finish by the end of the week, and it required all of his attention. As the meeting dragged on, Janet's voice became background noise, until suddenly, she stopped talking and turned directly to him. "Michael," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at him from across the table. "I don't know why you even bother showing up to these meetings. You never have anything useful to contribute." The words hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. His heart skipped a beat, and his stomach twisted in discomfort. He had been prepared for some criticism, but this was different. There was no subtlety, no veiled suggestion that he could improve. It was an outright dismissal, a public slap in the face. The room fell silent. All eyes were on him now. Michael felt his face flush with embarrassment, his throat tightening as the weight of Janet's words sunk in. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some with expressions of pity, others with barely concealed amusement. They had all seen this before, Janet's brutal critiques of those she didn't like or those who she thought were beneath her. It was nothing new. But for Michael, it was personal. His confidence, which had taken years to build, was suddenly shattered in a single moment. "I'm sorry," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Janet's expression hardened. "You heard me. I've been looking at your work lately, and frankly, it's pathetic. You're supposed to be the IT guy, but half the time, the systems crash on your watch. You're useless." Michael's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the blood rushing to his face, the hot wave of anger rising within him. He had always been diligent in his work, always put in the extra effort to ensure that the company's systems ran smoothly. To be called useless in front of everyone, it was beyond insulting. It was a blow to his pride, to everything he had worked for. "I've been handling the server updates," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. "The crashes weren't my fault. There were external factors." "I don't care about your excuses," Janet cut him off, her voice cold and unforgiving. "You're always full of excuses, Michael. Always. I'm done with it. You're a liability to this company. You're useless, and we don't need you anymore." The words were a dagger. Michael's chest tightened, and his mind raced. He had heard rumors that Janet wasn't happy with him, that she thought he was slow or inefficient, but this was something else entirely. This was an outright dismissal, a declaration that he was no longer needed. The humiliation was unbearable. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he had done everything he could. But in that moment, the words wouldn't come. All he could do was sit there, his mind spinning, as the rest of the meeting continued as if nothing had happened. As the meeting wrapped up, Michael remained in his seat, staring blankly at the table in front of him. Janet had moved on to other topics, but the sting of her words lingered in the air like a foul odor. He could hear his colleagues shuffling out of the room, their footsteps echoing in the hallway, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His mind was clouded with anger and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being a valued employee to someone who was so easily discarded? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Michael sat at his desk, trying to focus on the work in front of him, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the meeting. Janet's cruel words echoed in his mind, replaying over and over again. He couldn't understand why she had singled him out. He had always kept his head down, done his job without complaint. So why now? Why had she chosen him as the target of her anger? The eyes of his colleagues on him, some with expressions of pity, others with barely concealed amusement. They had all seen this before, Janet's brutal critiques of those she didn't like or those who she thought were beneath her. It was nothing new. But for Michael, it was personal. His confidence, which had taken years to build, was suddenly shattered in a single moment. "I'm sorry," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Janet's expression hardened. "You heard me. I've been looking at your work lately, and frankly, it's pathetic. You're supposed to be the IT guy, but half the time, the systems crash on your watch. You're useless." Michael's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the blood rushing to his face, the hot wave of anger rising within him. He had always been diligent in his work, always put in the extra effort to ensure that the company's systems ran smoothly. To be called useless in front of everyone, it was beyond insulting. It was a blow to his pride, to everything he had worked for. "I've been handling the server updates," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. "The crashes weren't my fault. There were external factors." "I don't care about your excuses," Janet cut him off, her voice cold and unforgiving. "You're always full of excuses, Michael. Always. I'm done with it. You're a liability to this company. You're useless, and we don't need you anymore." The words were a dagger. Michael's chest tightened, and his mind raced. He had heard rumors that Janet wasn't happy with him, that she thought he was slow or inefficient, but this was something else entirely. This was an outright dismissal, a declaration that he was no longer needed. The humiliation was unbearable. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he had done everything he could. But in that moment, the words wouldn't come. All he could do was sit there, his mind spinning, as the rest of the meeting continued as if nothing had happened. As the meeting wrapped up, Michael remained in his seat, staring blankly at the table in front of him. Janet had moved on to other topics, but the sting of her words lingered in the air like a foul odor. He could hear his colleagues shuffling out of the room, their footsteps echoing in the hallway, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His mind was clouded with anger and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being a valued employee to someone who was so easily discarded? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Michael sat at his desk, trying to focus on the work in front of him, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the meeting. Janet's cruel words echoed in his mind, replaying over and over again. He couldn't understand why she had singled him out. He had always kept his head down, done his job without complaint. So why now? Why had she chosen him as the target of her anger? Michael hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence, the weight of Janet's words still reverberating in his ears. He couldn't believe it. After years of hard work, of giving his all to this company, he had been unceremoniously discarded. Fired. Just like that. He felt the familiar burn of humiliation in his chest again, but this time, it was accompanied by an overwhelming sense of disbelief. How could she do this to him? After everything? His mind raced through the events of the previous day, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had always known that Janet could be harsh, but this? This was something else entirely. She had been building up to this moment, had been preparing to pull the rug out from under him for weeks, if not months. He had seen the signs, the subtle jabs, the dismissive comments, but he had never imagined it would escalate to this. Fired over a few critical words in a meeting? It didn't make sense. He had expected a difficult conversation, maybe a performance review, but this? He had been thrown away like yesterday's trash. The house was eerily quiet as Michael stared blankly at the phone in his hand. The anger that had boiled up inside him during the meeting had cooled, replaced by an empty, hollow feeling. He felt betrayed. He had poured everything into his job, had sacrificed so much to be good at what he did. And now, it meant nothing. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the way Janet had spoken to him, or the realization that he had given so much of himself to a company that could so easily discard him. The phone call had felt cold, impersonal, as though Janet had no real regard for the human being behind the employee number. He was just another name on a list of people she had decided weren't worthy of her time. Michael had never been one to dwell on things for too long, but the blow to his pride stung deeper than anything he had ever felt before. He had always believed that his quiet, hard-working nature would speak for itself. But here he was, alone in his apartment, unemployed, and unsure of what the future held. He had no plan B, no backup options. For the first time in years, he felt completely adrift, untethered from the life he had worked so hard to build. The next day, Michael woke up early, just as he had always done for work, but there was no rush, no deadline hanging over his head. He made his coffee in silence, his movements mechanical, almost robotic. The weight of the situation hung over him like a cloud. He had spent years in the same routine: wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. But now, he found himself staring at an empty day, a blank slate that felt more like a prison than an opportunity. What was he supposed to do now? He had no idea where to start. The idea of job hunting felt like a monumental task. He had no clue where to even look, who to contact, or what his next move should be. Every path seemed uncertain, clouded with doubt. The security he had once taken for granted was gone, and with it, his sense of purpose. As the day wore on, Michael tried to distract himself by browsing through job listings, but nothing seemed to jump out at him. He applied to a few positions, sending out his resume with little hope that anything would come of it. He had been in the industry for so long that he was beginning to feel like just another cog in the machine, another nameless face in a sea of applicants. The idea of starting over at a new company, trying to prove himself all over again, felt daunting. He had been fired once. What if it happened again? What if he wasn't good enough for anyone else? It was late afternoon when the unexpected twist came. The phone rang again, but this time, it wasn't Janet. It was an unfamiliar number, one that Michael didn't recognize. He hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what to expect. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but with an edge of urgency. "Hello, Mr. Hughes. This is Greg from IT Systems Services. We're calling to inform you that there's been a major systems failure across the company. We need you to come in immediately to assist with repairs." Michael's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he was speechless, his mind racing. Was this a mistake? Was this some sort of prank? The company had just fired him the day before, and now they were asking him to come in to fix their systems? The situation was surreal. But even as confusion flooded his thoughts, a flicker of something else stirred inside him, a sense of vindication. The systems had failed? And they wanted him to come in and help? Greg continued, unaware of Michael's internal conflict. It seems there's a massive crash in the network. We've tried everything on our end, but we need someone who knows the systems inside and out. You're the only one with the necessary experience. Can you come in right away? Michael's mind raced. It was an opportunity, there was no denying that. But what did this mean? After everything that had happened with Janet, did he really want to go back to the office, to face the people who had dismissed him so easily? 1,000 thoughts swirled in his head. His pride, his anger, everything that had built up inside him since Janet's cruel words flooded back in an instant. But at the same time, there was something else. A part of him that wanted to prove Janet wrong, to show her just how valuable he truly was, to show the company that they had made a colossal mistake. I'll be there, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. Within an hour, Michael found himself standing outside the office building, the familiar structure looming in front of him. The doors felt heavier than they ever had before, as if they were closing him off from something he once believed was his future. He walked through the lobby with purpose, trying to shake off the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him. As he made his way up to the IT department, he couldn't help but notice the tense atmosphere in the air. It was clear that everyone was on edge. People were running around, their faces lit up with anxiety as they scrambled to fix the issue. The sense of urgency was palpable, and Michael felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The chaos, the confusion, it felt like something he could handle. When he entered the IT room, he was greeted by several of his former colleagues, all of them wearing expressions of surprise. They had heard about his firing, but none of them had expected him to show up. Michael's presence was like a shot of adrenaline to the team. He got to work quickly, analyzing the network and diagnosing the issue. As he began to unravel the problem, it became clear that the failure was far more severe than anyone had anticipated. The system was down, not just for one department, but for the entire company. The crash had caused widespread chaos, grinding operations to a halt. Michael worked late into the night, piecing together the broken network, his mind focused on the task at hand. The urgency, the pressure, it was all-consuming. As the hours passed, he couldn't help but notice that the mood in the room had changed. The team was beginning to rely on him, to trust his expertise. And with each successful repair, Michael felt a sense of pride building inside him. This wasn't just about fixing the systems. It was about proving to himself, and to everyone else, that he was anything but useless. By the time dawn broke, the systems were back online, and the crisis had been averted. The team was exhausted but grateful. Michael's heart swelled with a sense of accomplishment. Despite everything, despite the way he had been treated, he had come through when it mattered most. As he packed up his things to leave, Greg pulled him aside, his expression one of genuine respect. "You saved us tonight, Michael," Greg said, his voice soft but sincere. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Michael nodded, his chest heavy with emotion. He had done it. He had proven his worth, not just to Janet, but to himself. And as he walked out of the building, the feeling of vindication washed over him. He wasn't useless. He wasn't disposable. He was valuable, and no one could take that away from him. But little did he know, the fallout from his unexpected return would be far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The morning after the crisis was a blur. Michael left the office in a daze, his body exhausted, his mind still processing the whirlwind of events. He had done it. He had fixed the system, saved the company from disaster, and in doing so, proven his worth. But as he sat in his car, parked outside the office building, a strange emptiness lingered inside him. The satisfaction of solving the problem, of being needed again, felt fleeting. He had been part of the team again, but only for a moment. Would they recognize him for his efforts? Would Janet? Or was this just a temporary blip, a brief reminder that he was capable before they dismissed him once again. His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from Greg, the head of IT. Michael's stomach tightened as he opened it. "Michael, I wanted to personally thank you again for everything last night. We couldn't have done it without you. I've already informed the higher-ups about your role in saving the systems. You should hear from them soon." The message hit him harder than he expected. Greg's words were genuine, but there was a part of him that knew this was just the beginning of something much more complicated. Would the higher-ups really recognize his contribution? Or was Greg simply trying to placate him, to smooth things over in the aftermath of a disastrous situation? Michael's thoughts were interrupted when his phone rang. He didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. The familiar number appeared on the screen, Janet. His heart sank. He had braced himself for this call, but it didn't make it any easier. Hesitantly, he answered. "Michael," Janet's voice was cool, calculated. "I'm sure you're aware of the situation yesterday. The systems crash. I'm calling to discuss it with you." He couldn't read her tone, but he knew this wasn't a call to offer thanks. He could sense the tension in her voice, the formality that had always been there, but now tinged with something else, something more distant. "I've heard from Greg," she continued, her words clipped. "I've been informed of your role in getting the systems back up and running. I wanted to personally thank you for your help." Her words were like ice, cold and without warmth. A part of him wanted to lash out, to remind her of how she had fired him, how she had humiliated him in front of his colleagues. But he didn't. He kept his composure, knowing that any emotional outburst would only confirm the image she had of him. He wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. "I'm glad I could help," Michael said evenly. "I did what needed to be done." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Janet spoke again. "However," she continued, her voice taking on a more authoritative tone, "the company has decided to reevaluate your position. We've had a chance to discuss your actions last night and the value you brought to the team. I want to be clear with you, Michael, your behavior during the incident will be reviewed by HR." Michael felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud still hit him like a ton of bricks. Her words were carefully chosen, but the underlying message was clear: this wasn't over. She wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. The fire of humiliation that had burned inside him the day before reignited, this time with a deeper sense of dread. He had helped the company, saved them from a catastrophe, and yet, now he was being treated like a suspect, like someone who had done something wrong. "I see," Michael said, his voice betraying none of the storm that raged inside him. "I'll wait to hear from HR then." "I'm sure you will," Janet replied. "But let me be clear, this incident doesn't change anything in terms of your employment. Your termination still stands." Michael felt his jaw tighten. The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. So much for proving his worth. So much for showing them just how valuable he was. In the end, it didn't matter. She had made her decision, and he wasn't going to change it. "I understand," he said, keeping his tone neutral, his voice betraying none of the frustration he felt. "Thank you for the update." The call ended, and Michael sat in silence for a moment, his phone still pressed to his ear as if he could somehow hear more, as if there was something else she hadn't said. But there was nothing. He hung up and stared at the screen for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What was the point of all of this? What was the point of helping them if they were still going to throw him away? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Michael tried to focus on his job search, but his mind kept drifting back to the phone call, to Janet's cold words. He didn't know what hurt more, being fired in the first place or being strung along with the faint hope of redemption, only to have it dashed at the last moment. He had fought so hard to prove himself, to show that he was more than just an expendable employee. And yet, it had all been for nothing. Days passed, and the weight of the situation grew heavier. Michael couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He knew he needed to move on, to find something else, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wronged, that he had been treated unfairly. He found himself questioning every decision he had made, every choice that had led him to this point. Had he made the right call staying with the company as long as he did? Had he missed signs that should have made him leave sooner? The questions haunted him, and the longer he thought about them, the more he became convinced that Janet's treatment of him was not just personal, but symptomatic of something larger, something that ran deeper in the culture of the company. It wasn't until the following week that Michael received another call from Greg. This time, the tone was different. The urgency had been replaced with something else, something softer, more empathetic. "Michael, I need to talk to you about something," Greg said, his voice low and serious. "I wanted to give you a heads up. I've heard through the grapevine that Janet's decision to fire you has caused quite a stir. A lot of people are upset about how you were treated, especially after everything you did last week." Michael's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the validation he had hoped for, the recognition that he wasn't as useless as Janet had made him feel. "I appreciate you letting me know," Michael said, his voice steady, though he felt a surge of emotion at the words. "But I've already been told that the decision stands." Greg hesitated. "Well, I'm not saying it's going to change anything, but I just wanted you to know that people are noticing. People care about what happened. And I think the company is going to have to reckon with how they handled this." Michael didn't know how to respond. The feeling of vindication that had been building inside him seemed to deflate as quickly as it had inflated. The truth was, none of this changed the fact that he was still out of a job. None of this changed the fact that he had been humiliated, dismissed, and left to pick up the pieces of his shattered career. But as Greg's words lingered in his mind, Michael realized something. It wasn't just about the company or Janet anymore. It was about him. He had done his best. He had shown his value, his worth, and now it was time to move on, to find something that truly appreciated him for who he was, not just for what he could do. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was ready. Ready to start over, to take back control of his future. The world wasn't finished with him yet. And neither was he. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions for Michael. Despite the deep sense of betrayal and frustration gnawing at him, he knew he had no choice but to push forward. The sting of being fired after such a monumental contribution was still raw, but the fire within him had begun to shift. It was no longer about seeking revenge or justice from Janet. It wasn't about showing her or anyone that they had made a mistake. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of much more than what they had reduced him to. He could feel his confidence beginning to rebuild, brick by brick, as he embraced the discomfort and uncertainty of this new chapter in his life. Every day was a battle of willpower, forcing himself out of bed, forcing himself to stay focused on the future despite the weight of the past. His mornings were spent combing through job listings, sending out applications, and networking with old colleagues who had reached out to offer support. The nights were filled with doubt, though. He couldn't help but feel the lingering sting of his termination. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for, the years spent at the company, the long hours, the sacrifices, had been for nothing. How could they so easily dismiss him, especially after his actions had prevented a company-wide disaster? It was a bitter pill to swallow. One evening, as he sat in his small apartment, scrolling through emails with a list of new job opportunities, his phone rang again. The number was unfamiliar, but something in him urged him to pick it up. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello? Michael? It's Greg." Michael sat up straight at the sound of Greg's voice. There was a sense of urgency in his tone that instantly piqued his interest. "Greg, what's going on?" "I didn't want to put this in an email," Greg said, his voice low. "But I think it's time you know what's happening behind the scenes." There's been a lot of talk about your firing. People are questioning it. And not just employees. It's gone higher up. Michael felt his heart race. What did he mean? Was this the validation he had been hoping for? What do you mean, higher up? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Greg paused for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. I'm talking about the board of directors. They're aware of the situation now, and they're not happy about how it was handled. There's been a lot of talk about the way Janet dismissed you after everything you did for the company. Michael could hardly believe what he was hearing. The board? The people who ran the company, who made the real decisions, were involved now. He had never imagined that things would go this far. It felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. I don't understand, Michael replied, his voice trembling slightly. Why would the board care? I'm just an employee. And I've already been told that my termination stands. I know, Greg said, his voice thick with frustration. But there's a growing sense that the whole thing was mishandled. And people are looking at Janet now. She's not getting off scot-free. Michael didn't know what to think. On one hand, the thought of Janet facing any consequences for her actions brought him a sense of satisfaction, but on the other hand, it didn't change the fact that he was still without a job. It didn't change the humiliation he had suffered. So, what does this mean for me? He asked. There's going to be a meeting next week, Greg replied. The board wants to go over the situation in detail. And they've asked me to be a part of it. They want to hear from me about your role in the crisis. I'll be backing you up. I think they'll listen. But I need to know if you're ready to speak up too. Michael didn't know what to say. The offer, or the possibility of having his side heard, was tempting. But at the same time, it was a gamble. Would speaking up actually change anything? Or would it just drag him through the mud again, exposing him to more pain and humiliation? But deep down, Michael knew that he had nothing to lose. If he didn't take this chance, he'd always wonder what could have been. I'll be ready, he said finally, the words coming out with a conviction that surprised him. I'm not going to sit here and let her get away with it. I'll speak up. Greg let out a relieved breath on the other end of the line. Good. I think this could be your chance to finally get the recognition you deserve. You've earned it, Michael. That night, Michael lay in bed, unable to sleep. The weight of the decision he had just made pressed down on him. He had been wronged. And now, it seemed that the world was finally starting to take notice. But what if it was too late? What if the damage had already been done, and no amount of speaking up could undo the past? He tossed and turned, the thoughts swirling in his mind, refusing to let him rest. The following week arrived quickly, and with it came the tense meeting Michael had been preparing for. He had spent days rehearsing what he would say, how he would tell his story, how he would present the facts. The meeting was scheduled for a Monday morning, and when the time finally came, Michael dressed in his best suit, determined to look the part, even if his confidence was shaken. As he entered the conference room, he noticed a few unfamiliar faces seated around the table. The board members, he assumed. His heart pounded in his chest as he took his seat, trying to focus on the task at hand. He was about to face the people who controlled the fate of the company, the people who held the power to change everything. Greg was already there, standing at the head of the table, ready to speak. He nodded to Michael, offering him a reassuring smile. Let's do this, Greg whispered as the room fell silent. The meeting began with a cold formality, the board members discussing mundane business matters before moving on to the issue at hand. Janet was present as well, sitting at the far end of the table, her eyes averted as if she were trying to avoid Michael's gaze. It was clear that she was on the defensive. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he cleared his throat and began. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. He recounted the events of that fateful day when the system crashed, explaining in detail how he had worked tirelessly to fix it, how he had saved the company from disaster. He described his sudden firing, the words Janet had used to describe him as useless, and the shock he had felt when he was dismissed without a second thought. He could see the expressions on the board members' faces begin to change as he spoke, their brows furrowed, their attention fully on him. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt like he was being heard. He wasn't just a cog in the machine anymore. He wasn't just the useless employee. He was Michael, a person who had given everything to this company, only to be cast aside. As the meeting continued, the conversation shifted to the company's handling of the situation. Janet attempted to defend her actions, but her voice faltered. The board was no longer on her side. Her authority seemed to erode with every word. Michael had expected nothing less. But what he hadn't expected was the board's final decision. "We're going to review this matter further," one of the board members said, looking directly at Michael. "We'll take into consideration what you've said, Michael, and we'll also be conducting an internal investigation into the actions of our management team. We'll be in touch." Michael left the meeting feeling both exhausted and oddly optimistic. It wasn't over yet, but he knew that he had done everything he could. He had taken a stand, and no matter what happened next, he would never let himself be. The days after the meeting were a blur for Michael. The decision by the board to launch an internal investigation had left him in a state of uncertainty. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but one thing was clear: things were moving. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was gaining some control over his life again. It wasn't just about the job or the firing anymore, it was about standing up for himself and letting the world know that he wouldn't be treated as invisible. Greg stayed in touch, providing him with occasional updates. There were murmurs that the internal investigation was stirring the pot, and the higher-ups in the company weren't exactly pleased with how things had been handled. Michael didn't know if this would translate into any real change, but he kept his fingers crossed. At least, he told himself, he wouldn't be swept under the rug like a forgotten mistake. One late afternoon, about a week after the board meeting, Michael received a call that would alter the course of everything. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but he answered it anyway. "Hello? Michael, it's Greg. You need to sit down." Michael's heart skipped a beat. The urgency in Greg's voice was undeniable. He sat on the edge of his bed, bracing himself for whatever news was coming. "Greg, what's going on?" Michael asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "There's been a change, and it's big," Greg replied, his words coming in a rush. "The board didn't just look at your case. They looked at everything. And they weren't happy with how Janet handled things. They've decided to take action." Michael's mind raced as he tried to process the information. "What does that mean? Is she getting fired?" "Not exactly," Greg said, his voice lowering. "But she's being reassigned. They're moving her out of the executive role and putting her in a different department. The company is acknowledging that her leadership was flawed. The damage control is already underway, and she's being forced to take a step back, overlooked again." A mix of relief and disbelief washed over Michael. This was the moment he had hoped for but never truly expected. Janet's fall from grace was unexpected, even by his standards. It was hard to believe that the person who had humiliated him, who had treated him as expendable, was now facing consequences. The weight of that moment began to settle in as Michael allowed himself to process the news. "But that's not all," Greg added. "The board is offering you something. They're considering a position for you, a senior management role. They want to bring you back. They want to recognize the value you brought to the company." Michael could hardly breathe. It felt surreal. Was this really happening? Was the company that had discarded him now offering him a way back in? He had imagined many outcomes, but this wasn't one of them. A senior management role? Are they serious? I know it's a lot to take in, Greg said, but it's happening. They're willing to make amends, and they want you to be a part of the new direction they're going in. They realize they made a huge mistake by letting you go, and they want to fix it. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a sense of power return to him. The world had seemed so unfair, so relentless in its desire to knock him down, but now, he was being offered a chance to reclaim what was his. But as much as he wanted to accept the offer and return to the company, there was a part of him that hesitated. I don't know, he said, rubbing his forehead as if to clear away the cloud of confusion. It's hard to believe. After everything that happened, can I really go back? What about all the things they did? The way Janet treated me? Greg's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. He knew Michael was wrestling with a tough decision, one that couldn't be made lightly. I get it, Greg finally said. But think about it, Michael. This could be your chance to make things right. Not just for yourself, but for everyone else who's been overlooked or mistreated. You're being given the power to lead, to change things. This could be the moment you've been waiting for. The words echoed in Michael's mind long after the conversation ended. He paced back and forth, torn between the possibilities before him. On one hand, he was being offered a position that could elevate his career, give him the recognition he had always deserved. But on the other hand, could he truly trust a company that had let him go so easily? Would he be walking back into the same toxic environment that had driven him out in the first place? As the days passed, Michael found himself consumed by these questions. He consulted with friends and family, and each conversation only seemed to complicate matters more. Some advised him to take the job, to accept the company's offer and move on. Others urged him to walk away, to avoid getting caught in a system that had already shown its true colors. The pressure of making the right decision weighed heavily on him. In the end, it wasn't the promises of prestige or power that swayed him. It was the realization that he had the ability to shape his future. He wasn't just going to let life happen to him anymore. He would take control, but on his own terms. After much soul-searching, Michael made his decision. He called Greg back, the decision firm in his voice. I'm not going back, Michael said. I'm done with that company. They had their chance, and they blew it. I'm going to find something better, something that values me for who I am, not just what I can do for them. Greg was silent for a moment, as if absorbing Michael's resolve. I understand, he said finally. But just know, you're a valuable person, Michael. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The next few weeks were a whirlwind as Michael focused on rebuilding his life. He spent time with loved ones, took care of himself, and most importantly, he learned to trust in his own abilities again. The lessons he had learned from this experience would stay with him for the rest of his life. As time went on, he found a new opportunity, a company that valued him not just for his skills, but for his character. And with this new job came a fresh start, one that would allow him to create the career and life he had always dreamed of. But the road to this new beginning wasn't easy. There were days when doubts crept in, when he questioned whether he had made the right decision. But with each passing day, the answer became clearer. Michael had learned to trust himself. He had taken a stand when it mattered most, and that had made all the difference. The company that had once tried to break him was now a distant memory, and in its place was a new life, one that would be shaped by his choices, his resilience, and his unwavering belief in his own worth. Looking back, Michael realized that the greatest lesson he had learned wasn't about fighting for a position or power. It was about learning to stand firm in the face of adversity, to trust that every setback was a stepping stone to something greater. And with that lesson in mind, he felt ready for whatever the future held. Months had passed since Michael made the difficult decision to walk away from his old company, and he was finally beginning to see the fruits of that choice. The uncertainty that had once consumed him was now replaced with a new sense of purpose. He had rebuilt his career, his self-esteem, and his confidence. But as he navigated his new life, he found himself thinking back to the events that led him here, the unexpected twists, the choices he had made, and the people who had been part of his journey. While it had been a painful road, the experiences had transformed him in ways he never imagined. One afternoon, as Michael sat in his new office, reviewing some documents, his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the best of him. He picked up the phone and answered. "Michael?" The voice on the other end was familiar but strained. "Janet," Michael replied, surprised to hear from her. He hadn't expected to hear from his former boss, not after everything that had happened. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I know it's been a while, and I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need to say something." Michael sat back in his chair, his emotions a mix of confusion and a lingering bitterness. He wasn't sure what she wanted, but part of him knew that hearing her out might offer him some kind of closure. "Go ahead," he said, his voice steady but guarded. I want to apologize," Janet said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I was wrong about you. I know I made a mistake, and I know that what I did was unfair and hurtful. I treated you badly, and I want to own that." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Michael had never expected an apology from Janet. In the months since the firing, he had often wondered if she even realized the damage she had caused. Hearing her admit to her wrongdoings was unexpected, and for a moment, Michael wasn't sure how to react. "You're right," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "You treated me like I was worthless. You made a decision that affected my life and my career. And then, you never even took responsibility for it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Michael could feel the weight of her regret. He had no illusions about who Janet was or the things she had done, but this moment felt different. She wasn't the same person who had fired him so callously. This was someone who had been forced to face the consequences of her actions, someone who was realizing just how far-reaching her mistakes had been. "I know I can't change what happened," Janet finally said. "But I want you to know that I've been reflecting on everything. I've seen the way the company has fallen apart since then. I've seen the mistakes they made, and I've seen the impact they had on so many people. And I've realized that the way I treated you was just the tip of the iceberg." Michael felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but it wasn't as sweet as he had imagined it would be. Part of him had wanted this moment, wanted to hear her apologize, wanted to see her acknowledge the hurt she had caused. But now that it was happening, he found that the anger and bitterness had faded. The past was the past, and he had moved on. "I appreciate the apology," Michael said after a moment. "But it's too little, too late. You can't undo what's been done." "I know," Janet replied quietly. "But I hope you know that I'm not the same person I was back then. I've learned a lot since then, about myself, about leadership, and about the importance of treating people with respect." Michael didn't know what to say. He had spent so much time and energy focusing on his own healing, and now here was Janet, talking about her growth. It almost felt like a full-circle moment, a reminder that people could change, but only if they were willing to face their own mistakes head-on. "I'm glad to hear that," Michael said sincerely. "I truly hope you've learned from this, but I've learned my own lessons too. And one of those lessons is that I can't stay stuck in the past. I'm focused on moving forward now." Janet let out a long, shaky breath. "I understand. I just wanted to reach out and say that I'm sorry. I've been carrying this guilt for so long, and I needed to make it right, even if it's too late." The conversation ended shortly after that, with no promises or resolutions. It was a brief, cathartic exchange, one that allowed both of them to say what had been left unsaid for so long. Michael hung up the phone feeling strangely calm. He wasn't angry, he wasn't bitter. He was just done. He had made peace with his past, and that was all that mattered. As the weeks went by, Michael's life continued to improve. His new job was a challenge, but in a good way. He found himself working alongside a team of individuals who valued his input and recognized his worth. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in the right place, doing the right work, with people who respected him. But it wasn't just his career that had changed. Michael's personal life had also undergone a transformation. He had grown closer to his family, rekindled old friendships, and started to make more time for himself. The stress that had once weighed him down had lifted, and in its place was a sense of freedom, freedom to be himself, freedom to pursue his dreams without fear of judgment or rejection. Looking back on the entire experience, Michael realized just how much he had grown. The person he was when he was fired by Janet was not the same person he was now. He had faced the hardest challenges of his life, and through it all, he had come out stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live life on his own terms. As he sat on the balcony of his apartment one evening, watching the sunset, he thought about the path that had brought him here. The road had been long, filled with moments of doubt and pain, but it had led him to a place where he was at peace with who he was and where he was going. He had fought for himself, for his dignity, and in the end, that fight had been worth it. In the quiet of the evening, Michael made a promise to himself. He would never again let anyone define his worth. He had learned that the true measure of success was not in the positions he held or the titles he earned, but in the strength of his character and the integrity of his actions. And with that, Michael's new life began, a life of purpose, fulfillment, and the unwavering belief that the best was yet to come. The story of his struggle, his rise from the ashes of betrayal, would be a reminder to him every day that sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories.